Hello, and welcome to If You Give a Mouse a Dagger, a Redwall RPG actual play podcast. I am your GM, Aubrey Massey, and this is an episode that we are calling The Basics of Fate, because Fate is the system that we are going to be using in order to play this RPG. While the most popular TTRPG is definitely Dungeons & Dragons, we didn't feel like it fit the game that we were trying to play, so instead we chose Fate Core. And since Fate Core isn't necessarily the most popular gaming system out there, I thought it might be a good idea to try and explain the basics of the game so that when you listen to 4 people playing it, it wouldn't be as confusing. So all of the rules that I'm going to go through come from the Fate Core rulebook. It's made by Evil Hat Productions. You can go on there and get the core rulebook yourself if you would like. It's very helpful. The biggest difference between Fate and most other TTRPGs like D&D is that Fate is created to be narratively driven rather than like rolling the dice driven. So what it basically comes down to is that the characters are going to describe an action, and from there we are all going to come together and kind of choose what they want to roll. And I'm not going to lie, we are so used to playing Dungeons & Dragons 5e that we are used to saying things like, I want to roll perception, I want to roll athletics to get across this gap, things like that. And so we messed up actually quite a few times in the first episode, but we're working on getting better at it because we feel like, once again, this system is better. So let's go into a few more differences, the thing that really make Fate. The first thing is the dice. Fate has its own kind of die. So most die have a certain amount of sides, and it starts, and one side has the number 1, and it goes all the way up to the number of the sides of the dice. But that's not the way Fate die work. One Fate die is a 6-sided dice, and on those 6 sides, 2 of those sides have a minus sign, 2 of those signs have a plus sign, and 2 of those signs are completely blank. Meaning that if I were to roll one Fate die, and it came up as a minus, that would be a -1. If I rolled a plus, it would be a +1. If I rolled a blank, it would be a 0. And I roll 4 of them all together. So the lowest possible roll is a -4, and the highest possible roll is a +4. The roll that comes up most often is 0. That's the most average roll that happens, meaning that there's a nice little bell curve rather than an even chance across the board of getting any result. There are 4 actions that any PC is going to roll for. There is an action to overcome, to create an advantage, to attack, or to defend. Those are the only 4 things that are going to happen. We're going to go through them one at a time, starting with the overcome action, which is an action where the PCs say, I want to do this, and there's some kind of passive opposition, like I want to jump over that gap. The opposition is how big the gap is. I want to pick that lock. The opposition is the lockpick. It is not a person per se. You're just trying to overcome some action. Now, when you roll these 4 Fate die and you would add any modifiers to it, you have 4 outcomes that can happen. You can fail the roll, you can tie the roll, you can succeed in the roll, or you can succeed with style in the roll. So let's first go over what it's like to fail an action. Failing happens when you roll a lower number than the target number. You don't get what you want, or you do get what you want, but at a serious cost. As GM, it is my job to make sure that this failure turns into something narratively interesting. And so, in my opinion, you just don't get it to unlock. Isn't that narratively pleasing? So let's go through some kind of situation. Portobello attempts to pick a lock, and I set my passive opposition at, let's say, 4, because it's a very tricky lock. And Portobello ends up rolling a 2. The way he fails is that he accidentally hits an internal mechanism, and that sets off an alarm, drawing everybody's attention. Now, Portobello can still pick the lock, but it'll cost him something serious. So Hana, who plays Portobello, could choose for Portobello to run away, which is still narratively fun as there's a loud alarm, right? Portobello still failed, there's something happening there. But Hana could also choose to have Portobello still pick the lock, but at a very serious cost. So I would come up with something like, when Portobello opens the door of the lock that he picked, the captain of the guard is standing directly in front of him with a pair of shackles in his hands. And that would be extra, extra bad. Now let's go over what would happen if there is a tie. So a tie happens when you roll the same as the target number. Tying is a lot like failing, but with less consequences. So with a tie, you get what you want, it just costs something minor, which generally just kind of means that the characters go from one sticky situation into a different sticky situation. So let's say Portobello does roll the 4 this time when trying to pick this lock. He's tying the passive opposition of the locked door. So he picks the lock, but as he opens the door, it squeaks quite loudly. And then from inside the room, he can hear, "Yeah, who is it?" from the captain. So Portobello has picked the lock, but he's done it at the cost of now the captain is aware that somebody is around. And now he's in a new situation that he's going to have to talk his way out of. So it's a different kind of situation because he tied the roll. He got what he wanted at a different cost. Now, what were to happen if Portobello succeeded? The success happens when you roll either 1 or 2 shifts higher than the target number, and you get what you want at no cost. So if the passive opposition is a 4 and Portobello rolls a 6, that is a success because it's 1 or 2 numbers higher than the passive opposition. So I would say that the door unlocks, and now Portobello can choose what happens next. But there's another option called succeeding with style. And this happens when you roll 3 or more shifts higher than the target number. You get what you want with an added benefit. So let's say when Portobello is rolling to pick this lock, Portobello rolls a 7. So I would say that in the midst of it, Portobello realizes that the door is going to squeak if he opens it. So he uses one of his feet to take out an oil can, and he oils the door hinges while simultaneously picking the lock with his hands. And so when he decides to open the door, there's absolutely no sound whatsoever. And if there's anybody inside that room, they have absolutely no idea that Portobello is in there with them at all. So that's the added benefit, right? He picked the lock, that's the success. The added benefit is that nobody has any idea that he picked the lock. So let's move on to the next little bit that kind of ties into what we've been talking about. Skills. When a character decides to take an action, there's a skill that is associated with that action. So let's say picking a lock, like Portobello is doing to that door. The skill that Portobello is going to use is burglary. If Diggs is looking for an object in a large pile of papers, then he's going to roll notice. And if Clementine's trying to climb a wall, let's say, Clementine is going to roll athletics. There's a skill for everything. We use the standard skill list that is in the Fate Core handbook, except for drive. We don't use drive because I just don't see this ever happening in the campaign, and I don't want somebody to invest a high bonus to drive if it's never going to show up. Each skill is assigned a bonus of +1, +2, +3, +4, or +0, or -1, which then would add to the roll of the 4 fate die in order to get the final result. Our characters have arranged their skills in what is called the skill pyramid. Their best skill is assigned a +4 bonus, and it sits all by itself in the +4 row. So there's only one skill that is +4. They then pick the next 2 best skills and assign them the +3. So there's 1 in +4, there's 2 in +3, and then in the one underneath it, +2, there are 3 skills. And then underneath +2, in the +1 row, there are 4 skills. So it ends up making a kind of triangle pyramid looking thing. The rest are typically at 0 if they don't fit in the +1, +2, +3, or +4. However, our characters have decided to make 3 of their skills at a -1 in order to create more interesting rolls. The next most important thing, and I would actually say the thing that I love most about the Fate system, is called aspects. And aspects are just descriptions. They can describe PCs, NPCs, the state of the world, or the environment that our heroes find themselves in. but it's just a description is what it does. And these descriptions, of course, help our players roleplay their characters a little bit better, but they also have this mechanical purpose within the game rules. So then if a character wants an aspect to work in their favor, they do something called invoking it. And if I, as the GM, want the aspect to work against the characters, I do this thing called compelling it. So these descriptions can be good or bad or a little bit of both, and that's kind of how it drives this forward. So let's talk about PC aspects that are assigned directly to the characters themselves. PC aspects describe who the characters are in a way that kind of makes them seem very good, but could also be their vices, something wrong with their personalities that makes them mess up a lot, or something right in between. So every character has what's called a high concept, which is a very basic descriptor of the character that explains how and why they are special within this world. So Diggs the Bold, his high concept is Badger Knight of the Order of the Crescent. He stands out because he's a badger, he's a knight, and he works for the Order of the Crescent. It makes him unique. Clementine's high concept is that she is an elderly advocate of the downtrodden. It highlights her age, it highlights the thing that she cares about most in the world. And Portobello's high concept is adorable orphan street hamster, because he's an orphan hamster that lives on the street and he's quite cute. Each character also has this thing called a trouble aspect, which instead of the more positive high concept, this is supposed to be inherently negative about the character. And it's basically created so that I, as the GM, can mess with them all I want. So Diggs the Bolt has the trouble aspect, will do anything for fame and glory, which means I'm going to give him a lot of scenarios in which he can get himself into trouble by being boastful. Clementine's trouble aspect is nobody pays any mind to an old brown squirrel, which means that no matter how good Clementine is at talking, she's still going to seem outdated and therefore is going to be ignored. Portobello is prone to extravagant lies, which means that even if telling the truth is the better option, Portobello is still probably going to lie. Also, if an NPC knows Portobello, they'll be less likely to believe him when he's actually telling the truth. Each character also has 3 other aspects, but these are neither inherently good nor bad, and they're supposed to be a mix of both, so that they can invoke them to do good, and I can compel them in order to make things worse for them. Portobello has the aspect street smart, not book smart. It's naturally going to give him a disadvantage for things like academic work, just reading, that kind of stuff in general, but could also give him an advantage if he's in a new city. He might just inherently kind of know things a little bit better. Diggs the Bold has the aspect Vanquisher of the Great Wolf, which could help him gain some rapport with other great warriors and hunters and things like that, but also might give him attention that he doesn't want in a crowded area. Clementine has the aspect the harsh judge in the New Canopy monthly cooking contests, which will give her an advantage with things related to culinary affairs and may help her seem more intimidating from time to time. However, the tone of the voice of the harsh judge may not work in every situation and just might offend somebody enough to have them never want to talk to Clementine ever again. So let's talk a little bit about this whole invoking and compelling process. PCs can get boosts to the rolls through a process called invoking. If the roll that a PC makes isn't quite high enough to succeed, what they can do is invoke an aspect, and that allows them to either re-roll the roll altogether or to add a +2 to the roll. They do this by spending a fate point, and then they give a valid narrative description as to why that aspect will help them in that exact situation. And I'll go over what fate points are here in just a second. On the other side of that coin, I, as the GM, get to use these same aspects, but to create chaos and conflict in the lives of the characters. I also spend a fate point, giving it to whichever character whose aspect I'm compelling. It just takes form in a different way than a reroll or a +2. What I can do is I add something new to the story, or I try to get a character to make a choice that will lead to other consequences. So mine's more of an overarching story narrative. Theirs is a help their own action in some sort of way. So what are fate points? Fate points are basically plot tokens. It tells me as the GM to take the reins that are controlling the overarching plot and hand it to the player for a little bit. Somebody says, I invoke this aspect. I say, okay, you gotta spend a fate point. They give me that fate point. I hand over the reins. They say about how being an elderly advocate for the downtrodden, they really do know how old people work, so they're going to be able to get this old person to do exactly what they want, so on and so forth, something like that. Every session, the players start out with a certain amount of fate points that they call their refresh. Clementine and Portobello both have a refresh of 3, meaning that at the beginning of every session, they will have 3 fate points. Diggs the Bold has a refresh of 2 because Eric, the person who plays Diggs, decided to give up a point of refresh in order to take an extra stunt. We'll go over stunts later. Speaking of aspects, there's another thing that players can roll for called creating an advantage. Creating an advantage is the kind of role that allows a player to create an aspect and tie it to either the environment that they are in or to another character. So let's go over the 4 ways that creating an advantage could pan out, basing if they fail, tie, succeed, or succeed with style. So let's go over failing first. If you fail to create an advantage roll, you either don't create the aspect at all, or you create it and someone else gets the free invocation. Let's say that Clementine is attempting to convince the leader of a town to evacuate because the affliction is right on the horizon and going to take over the city. She makes a compelling argument for him to think about his own family and how he would feel if they got sick with the affliction. Clementine ends up failing the roll. Now Tessa can choose to just not create the aspect, in which case the leader lets her know that he doesn't have any family to speak of, or Tessa can create the aspect worried about his family. But instead of Clementine being able to invoke it, the leader's suspicious second in command is going to get to invoke it. And he will. And he will use it to his advantage to further his power within the city. Now let's say there's a tie. With a tie, an aspect is created, but it can only be invoked once before it goes away. So this is known as a boost. An aspect is a much more permanent thing. A boost is temporary. So Clementine, after giving her argument, creates the boost thinking about his children and applies it to the town leader. Clementine can then invoke this aspect once before the leader's mind kind of changes thoughts and thinks about something else. So that's what a tie does. With a success, then the aspect is created and Clementine would get 1 free invocation, meaning that she would not have to spend a fate point in order to invoke this aspect and get a +2 or a reroll. If she succeeds with style, meaning that she succeeds with 3 shifts, then she would have created the aspect and she gets 2 free invocations of that aspect. Now let's talk about stunts, which is kind of the combination of skills and aspects that make the PC stand out. Stunts are just specific bonuses that apply to very specific situations. So for example, Diggs the Bold has the stunt Grappler, which gives him a +2 to physique rolls made when he's trying to create an advantage on an enemy by wrestling or grappling them. So if Diggs is trying to pin an enemy against a wall, this stunt would apply because it's a physique roll, because it's a show of strength. He's trying to create an advantage, pinned, and he's using wrestling or grappling to do so because he's going to grab them and push them up against the wall to pin them. It would apply. However, if Diggs wanted to pick up a table and throw it at somebody, that would still be a physique roll because it's using strength, but the stunt bonus would not apply because he is not trying to create an advantage and he is not trying to wrestle or grapple somebody. Speaking of violent things like this, let's talk a little bit about combat. Fate also has a system for combat, but it is very different than what you're probably used to in games like Dungeons & Dragons. And it's something that we are also getting used to, because there are no hit points, there's no armor class, there's no specific damage for different weapons, etc., things like that. There is still, however, attacking and defending. Attacking happens when one character wants to inflict direct harm to another character. And there are several ways to do this. Physical harm, or physical stress, where you would use fight to cause physical stress up close, and then there's shoot, which you would use to cause physical stress from far away. But there are also other types of conflicts, like mental battles. A player might use provoke, empathy, or deceive in order to cause mental stress to another character. Defending happens when a character wants to harm another character, and that character doesn't like that one bit. When it comes to physical conflicts, athletics is kind of the catch-all for defending against physical stress, and will is the skill that is the catch-all for resisting mental stress. Now, what is stress? Stress is not hit points. That's the first thing that it is definitely not. It is not that this character takes a certain amount of stress and then they're knocked out or they die or something like that. Stress instead is a narrative tool to show how many ways the PC can barely escape physical harm, more like a luck counter or the amount of endurance that a character has. The characters all have two stress tracks, a physical stress track and a mental stress track. They are represented by a series of boxes, with the first one on the left labeled 1, the second one labeled 2, third, 3, 4, so on, etc., etc. Each box is how many shifts of that particular kind of stress a character can take before they are no longer able to stay in conflict. Diggs, as the big burly type, has more physical stress boxes than Clementine does, but Clementine, the hard-headed old lady, has more mental stress boxes than Diggs does. So in order to make more sense of stress, attacking, and defending, we're going to go over the 4 outcomes: failing, tying, succeeding, and succeeding with style for both attacking and defending. So each time there is an attack, both the attacking character and the defending character roll dice, and then those two rolls are compared. So here are some examples. Let's say Diggs is attacking a fox that has been bothering Portobello, and Diggs decides to swing his poleaxe at him, which means he's going to roll fight. The fox, wanting to dodge out of the way of the poleaxe, is going to roll athletics in order to dodge. Diggs rolls a 3, and the fox rolls a 4, meaning that Diggs fails his attack roll, while the fox succeeds his defend roll. Diggs causes no stress to the fox, and the fox lives to see another day. Now let's say that the fox rolled a 6 instead of a 4. Diggs still rolling a 3. Since the fox beat Diggs' attack roll by 3, the fox succeeded with style on that defense roll. So instead of just not being harmed at all, the fox earns a boost, which you'll remember is kind of a temporary aspect. But what if Diggs rolls higher? Let's say Diggs rolls a 5 and the fox rolls a 4, which is a regular success for Diggs and a failure for the fox. We then subtract the defense roll from the attack roll, and we see how many shifts of stress that fox will take. So 5 minus 4 is 1. The fox would have to check his 1-point stress box, and I would make some kind of narrative reason as to how that fox barely escaped dying that time. Now let's say that Diggs rolls a 6 and the fox rolls a 3. Diggs just succeeded with style, and the fox has to use his 3-point stress box. Now let's say in this example that the fox does not have a 3-point stress box at all. He's already used his first 2. The fox realizes that he can't win, and he's going to concede the fight. He's going to be taken out. Diggs will have the upper hand and will be able to choose what to do with this fox. Also, for succeeding with style, Diggs earns a boost, a temporary aspect. And what happens when they tie? Diggs and the fox both roll a 3. In this case, the fox takes no stress, and Diggs gets a boost. It's kind of a nice middle ground. PCs also have another way of prolonging their time in a fight called a consequence. Consequences are aspects that describe an injury the characters take, and those consequences also absorb a specific amount of stress. So a mild consequence is going to absorb 2 shifts of stress, a moderate consequence absorbs 4 stress, and a severe consequence 6 stress. So let's say Diggs gets hit by the fox for a whopping 5 shifts of stress. Diggs doesn't have a 5-point stress box, so he takes a moderate consequence, which we end up calling broken ribs. And that absorbs 4 stress, which means that Diggs only has to check off his 1-shift physical stress box. And we have a narrative reason for how it hit him in the ribs, but he's able to endure it. Now, stress boxes become unchecked at the end of a conflict, because remember, they aren't hit points, but rather more of a luck counter or the amount of endurance a character has to fight, while consequences are aspects, and they stick around for a while. So I, as the GM, can spend a fate point to boost an NPC's attack or to compel something nasty until that consequence goes away, which may take several scenes or several sessions in order to get rid of that consequence. The other thing that makes combat unique in Fate is that at any point during a fight, a PC or an NPC can concede the conflict. And at that point, they're untouchable. It's kind of like scripted plot armor. Well, unscripted plot armor is really what it's like. So a PC can concede during a conflict. It's not like, oh, well then you give up, so the orc hits you over the head and you're dead now, sorry. It's more like a PC realizes that they're not going to win the fight, and so they decide, I'm going to concede. I now hide behind these boxes. I jump out the window and run away. Something like that. They kind of get this narrative choice to themselves. And that basically sums up the basics of the rules of Fate Core. If you listened all the way through it, I hope you learned something and are ready to start listening to If You